Hello, biology students, and today I'm going to be walking you through sections 3.1 and 3.2 of your ecology packet. So make sure you have done these sections, so they will be marked as late if they are not completed. So let's get started. So remember, these correspond to your text. I am on a different document, but each of these were provided to you in separate documents. Okay, section 3.1, what is ecology? Interactions and interdependence. All right, so list 3 organisms shown in the picture. List 3 non-living parts of the ecosystem. All right, so 3 living things in that picture would be plants, moss, bacteria, and perhaps even the snail pictured. And some non-living parts would be the water, the rocks, air, and our sunlight. So remember that our living things in our ecosystem are known as biotic factors, and our non-living things in an ecosystem are known as abiotic factors. Number 2, what is ecology? So this goes back to those notes that we took from ecology, so this should be familiar to you, as well as much of the stuff we talk about in section 3.2. What is ecology? It is the scientific study of interactions among organisms in their environment. So it not only includes interactions between the living organisms, but interactions between the organisms and the abiotic factors in their environment when we start to talk about that ecosystem level. Number 3, what does the biosphere contain? So it is the combined portions of the planet in which all life exists. This would include land, water, and the atmosphere. So from the bottom of the ocean to the top of Mount Everest, essentially about 29,000 feet, nothing is really going to live above that part of the lower atmosphere. So that kind of thin margin of Earth is what we call the biosphere. It is actually not that big compared to the entire size of Earth. Levels of organization. Why do ecologists ask questions about events and organisms that range in complexity from an individual to the biosphere? So essentially, the long and the short of it is that they want to understand relationships in the biosphere, whether that be among populations of, say, elk in Yellowstone National Park, or maybe on a larger ecosystem level, like perhaps how are environmental pollutants impacting this stream community? These are all questions that we can answer by researching ecology, so it's a really important field, especially in today's day and age. Number 5, complete the table about the levels of organization. So species, remember, is a group of organisms that can breed and produce fertile offspring. A population then is a group of individuals that belong to the same species and live in the same area. So an example of a species would be like elk. Population is a herd of elk in Yellowstone National Park. A community is an assemblage of different populations of organisms that live together in an assigned area. So for example, the elk and the wolves in Yellowstone National Park would be a community. We're still focusing on just living things. An ecosystem, all of the organisms that live in a particular place together with our physical environment. So we could say Yellowstone National Park, factoring in our physical abiotic features like the geysers, like our mountains, like our weather patterns, like snow, so on and so forth. Biome is that kind of, it's larger than an ecosystem, but smaller than the biosphere. It's a group of ecosystems that have the same climate and dominant communities. Example would be the Arctic tundra, very cold, very dry, or the desert, very warm, very dry, or the ocean, tropical rainforest, so on and so forth. And the highest level of organization that ecologists study can be the biosphere, though they usually stop at biome. It's pretty tough to study the entire Earth, the living portion of the Earth at the same time. 7. How are the words ecology and ecosystems different? So an ecosystem is all of the organisms and their physical environment, and ecology is more of the study of the interactions that occur in that ecosystem. So they're very similar. Number 8, what are the three basic approaches scientists use to conduct modern ecological research? So observing is a big one, and then conducting experiments, and then based on their data, they can model whatever the dynamics at play in that ecosystem are to make it more applicable elsewhere or more useful to them. Number 9, why might an ecologist set up an artificial environment in a laboratory to imitate and manipulate conditions that organisms would encounter in the natural world? So essentially, you can have more of a controlled experiment. Remember, that's to change one variable if you do it in a lab versus in the field. It is more, the field is much more complex to carry out controlled experiments in. Number 10, why are many ecological phenomena difficult to study? They occur over long periods of time, maybe even millions of years if you're talking about evolution and natural selection, or on a large spatial scale. So perhaps across an entire state or Yellowstone National Park, which is millions of acres. So pretty difficult to study that. Takes a lot of time. And these processes are slow to begin with. So even in one human lifetime, that might not be enough time to really gain the full understanding of the phenomena at play. 11, why do ecologists make models? To gain insight into complex phenomena. So there's many things that we can't experiment on directly, or like climate, for example, we have to make models and mathematical equations to kind of create some form of like predictability to it, because it's oftentimes unpredictable. So that's why they use models. Is the following sentence true or false? An ecological model may consist of a mathematical formula. That's true. Ecology and math, especially in population dynamics, oftentimes go together because population growth can be modeled using a lot of mathematical functions, which are really useful to tell us how many individuals there are, what's happening to them, what might be some causes of why they're increasing or decreasing. All right, now let's move on to section 3.2 on energy flow. What is at the core of every organism's interaction with the environment? So essentially, all energy comes from the sun, right? So at the core of every organism's interaction is its quest, its craving for energy, essentially. It needs energy to power its life processes like growth, like development, like cellular respiration, for example. And we'll talk about that going forward. What source of energy do organisms use if they don't use the sun's energy? So they can actually use chemical compounds like sulfur, for example. And these are called not photoautotrophs, but they're called chemoautotrophs in a process known as chemosynthesis instead of photosynthesis. So such organisms rely on energy stored in inorganic chemical compounds. So what are autotrophs? Prefix auto means self, like an autobiography. Suffix troph means feeder, so they are self-feeders, they feed themselves. And they're organisms that can capture energy from sunlight or chemicals and use that energy to produce their own food, which is pretty cool. So that is why they're also known as producers, because they produce their own food. They make their own food. And they are providers for the rest of our food chain / food web by giving it energy to work with. What do autotrophs do during photosynthesis? So essentially they take in light energy and CO2 and use it to produce, or in addition to water, they take in light energy, CO2, and water, and use it to produce oxygen and sugars. So that's what it says here, sugars like starch. For each of the following, write which kind of autotroph is the main producer. On land, it's obviously going to be plants. Plants are the main producer, and plants evolved and came onto land, as you would learn about if you took botany, 470 million years ago with our mosses. So they've been around a long, long, long time, long before the dinosaurs ever set foot on land. In the upper layers of the ocean, the main producer is algae. So in the upper, I think it's like 10 meters, 25 meters, that's what they call the photic zone. I think it's 100 meters actually. That's where light can get to, and that's where the algae lives. That's where the majority of all the primary productivity happens, which is energy produced by primary producers, which are algae in the case of the upper ocean. There are also some really kind of harsh environments that are so dynamic, they change so frequently. Tidal flats and salt marshes. These can only support photosynthetic bacteria, which are their autotrophs and their producers. Chemosynthesis is the process by which organisms use chemical energy to produce carbohydrates. So they wouldn't use light energy, they would use chemical energy in the form of maybe sulfurous compounds or carbon compounds. So just know that essentially autotrophs don't just have to use sunlight. They can use other stuff too if sunlight isn't available to make their own energy. And bacteria that carry this out commonly live deep in like hydrothermal vents on the ocean floor, really remote, extreme places, high temperature, high pressure, high acidity or salinity. So volcanic vents, hot springs in Yellowstone, good example, like Old Faithful, geysers. They also live in more common places like tidal marshes along coastlines, salty areas. Heterotrophs are called consumers. So if we break down the word heterotroph, hetero means different. You'll learn about, say, heterozygous in genetics. Troph means feeder, so different feeder. They must eat something different. They cannot feed themselves, so they must consume something else. And depending on what they consume is what level we put them at. Plant and animal remains and other dead matter are collectively known as detritus. So detritus is all that kind of decaying matter from once living animals that detritivores and decomposers will use to return those nutrients to the environment. So here is our table. Herbivore is a heterotroph that obtains energy by eating only plants or producers. Examples, cows or rabbits, or say deer that would eat the grass. Carnivore is a heterotroph that eats animals or other consumers. So you think about carnivores, like if you've seen Jurassic Park, carnivores eat meat, they would say. That means they eat other consumers or animals. So a T-Rex or a snake or a dog or an owl, say eating a mouse, would be a carnivore. Whereas an omnivore is kind of a jack of all trades. They eat both plants and animals, both producers and consumers. Examples are us, humans, so we might eat lettuce, but then we might eat a big steak, so that makes us omnivores. Bears as well, when bears come out of hibernation in the early spring, they are ravenously hungry, so they eat, and they keep eating, so they would eat berries and perhaps salmon as well. Detritivores are heterotrophs that feed on dead plant and animal remains, but these actually eat those remains, and they're larger, mostly animals like mites, earthworms, snails, and crabs. They don't break it down at the microscopic chemical level like decomposers do, and these ones are oftentimes bacteria and fungi that break down the organic matter. They don't actually really eat the matter per se. Number 12, how does energy flow through an ecosystem? This is a unidirectional flow, a one-directional flow through an ecosystem. Unlike matter, which cycles, energy flows. So energy flows, matter cycles. So make sure to remember that energy flows, matter cycles. So how does it flow through an ecosystem? It flows from the sun or inorganic chemicals, if we're talking about those chemoautotrophs, to our producers who harness that energy, our autotrophs, and then to the various consumers who eat them, or heterotrophs. So let's talk about these relationships. So food chains are a series of steps in which organisms transfer energy by eating and being eaten. It's a simplified linear model, so much simpler than things would actually occur in nature. So we're going to see that food webs are consisted of multiple food chains in once. all at once. So a food chain is a simple linear model. A food web is a network of complex interactions formed by feeding relationships. A food web is much more realistic to what would actually occur in nature, because nature is oftentimes much more complex than we can ever model in a lab. So a food web links together all the food chains in an ecosystem, whereas an atrophic level is a step in a food chain or the food web. So we have multiple trophic levels in a food chain / food web. First trophic level being the producers, and all the trophic levels above being consumers. The primary consumers eat the producers, secondary consumers eat the primary consumers, so on and so forth. What does a consumer in a food chain depend on for energy? It depends on whatever the trophic level below it is. If you're a primary consumer, you depend on the producers. If you're a tertiary or third level consumer, you depend on the secondary consumers. 18. What is an ecological pyramid? So an ecological pyramid is a diagram that shows the relative amounts of matter contained, or of energy or matter contained within each trophic level in a food chain or a food web. So we're going to see that essentially as matter cycles in a pyramid, it tends to stay relatively similar, but as energy cycles or flows up a pyramid, it's going to decrease at each trophic level by 90%. So only 10% is going to be left. So why is it that only part of the energy stored in one trophic level, or 10%, is passed on to the next level? So that's because most of that energy is used by organisms for life processes like cellular respiration, growth and development. Much is lost as heat in each step along the way. We would call that respiratory heat, is what I think they call it in college, I learned. So it's kind of the energy that the organism has to use to do its own biological processes and add its own biomass before that energy can be passed when it's consumed or eaten. So if we fill in the blanks on this pyramid, yours will look a little bit different than mine, but essentially we're going to start with 100%, or if you want to think about this as calories, 100 calories at the first level. First trophic level are producers. Only 10% makes it to our next level. You can see the other 90% is lost as heat. So we have 10 calories left here at our primary consumer level. We go up another level. We've got our secondary consumers. Only 10% of the 10%, which is 1%, is left at our secondary consumer level. And then 10% of the 1%, which is only 1/100th of our original, is left at our tertiary consumer level. All right, carrying on. Sorry, we got interrupted by the pledge momentarily. So what is biomass? So biomass is different than energy. So biomass, and if when you take chemistry, I know you haven't had it yet, you're going to learn that mass is the amount of matter that makes up something. So when you're going to learn about what matter is, but essentially matter is the physical material that makes up this universe. So we are made of matter. The desk I'm sitting at is made of matter. So biomass is the biological matter that fills up an ecosystem, like the woody trunk of a tree would be biomass, the root mass of a tree would be biomass, a fox's body would be biomass. So it's the total amount of living tissue within a given trophic level. What does a biomass pyramid represent? It represents the amount of potential food, keyword potential, available for each trophic level in an ecosystem. So biomass, cycles a little bit different than, say, energy would. So we're going to take a look at pyramids in the future with biomass. And then another type of pyramid is a pyramid of numbers. This one shows the relative number of individual organisms at each trophic level. So we're going to find out that, like our energy, there's much more energy at the bottom of our pyramid. There's going to be many more individuals at the bottom of our pyramid because there's much more energy to support those individuals. At the top of our pyramid, For example, animals at the top of the food chain, like for example, I'm going to use a mountain lion because nothing really eats them, and they're pretty awesome. Essentially, there would be very few of those in an ecosystem, maybe just one, because so little energy is left by the time it gets up to these third level consumers to begin with, that there's just not much energy left, and they need to eat a lot as a result in order to survive. I think it's something on the order of like 100 deer a year, or like 50 deer a year are needed to sustain a mountain lion. So it's constantly hunting, and its territory is huge. Like a male mountain lion might roam about 800 miles in its territory. So an ecosystem cannot support many mountain lions, or apex predators, we would call them, which are those top level predators that make the capstone to our pyramid here, the top piece of it. All right, so 24, the last question. Why can each trophic level support about only 1/10 of the amount of living tissue below it? That's because each trophic level harvests only about 1/10 of the energy from the level below it. So there's only 1/10 of the individuals at maybe our mountain lion apex predator level than there would be of deer, or maybe even less than 1/10, because there's only 1/10 of that energy from the deer's body goes into the mountain lion, whereas the deer would have gotten a lot more energy from the grass than the mountain lion gets from it, if that makes sense. Let me know if you have any questions. So don't necessarily expect that I'll be going through all of the unit packet like this, but I just wanted to provide it for you virtual folks, so that we're on the same page as we begin this second unit, ecology. And remember, your worksheet's going to look a little bit different. So next time we'll move on to ecological pyramids and talk more about that with our POGIL, and look for assignments going forward. All right, everybody. Have a wonderful day, and take care. Bye.